Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our webinar number 6 of our Beicip-Franlab software webinar series. This webinar will be on modeling carbonate reservoir heterogeneity, with DionisosFlow. We thank you all for registering and attending the meeting, and we hope you will find it interesting and useful. Your speakers today will be Nicolas Aoui and Samer Boudaher, and I will be your moderator. My name is Elsie Thébault. Nicolas and Samer are two of our experts in forest stratigraphic modeling, and they both specialize in carbonates. So I hope we will all be able to give you a good presentation and answer all your questions. So before starting, here are a few meeting guidelines. So as you may have already noticed, you are all automatically muted. If you have any questions during the presentation, you can use the questions panel and we will answer them during the Q&A breaks. But please ask your questions as soon as you have them and don't wait for the breaks to ask them. It will ease the process to answer you all. We will also be putting out some polls in the polls panel, so check it out from time to time. And finally, this meeting is being recorded and you will have the video available in a few days on our YouTube channel. And by the way, some of our webinars are already available there, so please go and check it out. So this is it. I will now leave the floor to Nicolas, and I wish you all a good webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, Elsie, and hope everyone is doing well. So today's agenda will be dealing with 3 main points. Firstly, we'll be discussing and introducing for you forward stratigraphic model and its application to carbonate systems. And then I'll be discussing a bit about some examples and some feedback from work conducted on Mesozoic carbonate platforms, mainly in the Middle East. And then we'll have a small Q&A break. And then finally, Samer will be discussing about the advance of forward stratigraphic modeling and its implementation with reservoir characterization. And also we'll have a Q&A break. So firstly, I'll introduce for you forward stratigraphic modeling of carbonate systems using DionisosFlow. So as most of you know, carbonate systems represent more than 40% of reservoirs of oil and gas in the world. They are spread along the stratigraphic record from the Paleozoic to the Mesozoic to the Cenozoic, and they have a major importance in new oil and gas discoveries around the world. So carbonate systems are very varied in terms of architecture and even also in terms of textures and facies. And this is a nice example showing you an image from the Great Barrier Reef, where you can see a wide carbonate reef extending along kilometers and kilometers. And then to its western part, you will be able to see an open marine system with much deeper deposits, usually mudstone. And towards the eastern part, you will see some ponds of mudstone, lagoonal mudstone, and some shoals. And you can see the diversity of carbonate facies and even carbonate geometries in a very short distance. So carbonate systems are mainly systems which are influenced by different types of factors that we will discuss later on. They will be impacted by, of course, paleogeography, wave action, USTC, carbonate production rate, also not to forget erosion and how are they transported. You know, carbonates are developed in situ, but they are transported because of wave energy or even because of gravity and slope. Carbonates can, as you all know, develop under different types of geometries, depending on your sequence stratigraphic framework. You will see wide platform aggradations, you can see cliniforms or progradations, retrogradations, buildups in rim platforms, for example, or mounded features like the Dicodium basinella mounds or oolitic shoals and ramps. So carbonates are really sensitive to ecology, and they usually develop in hot areas with latitude between 30 north and 30 south, and temperatures they are usually more than 20 degrees with salinities which are relatively moderate, between 32 and 40 per mil. Note that when temperature drops below the 20 degrees, some carbonates will not be thriving anymore, like corals and green algae. And also something which is very interesting to point to is that not all carbonate fauna developed similarly at the same pace and at the same rate along the stratigraphic record from the Paleozoic to the Mesozoic into the Cenozoic. So this is the small left part of the figure that shows you the different types of carbonate evolution through time. So what you need to focus a lot whenever you're thinking about modeling the carbonate platform is to try to understand what type of carbonate factories you're looking at. because different carbonate factories, so the three main ones, tropical factory, the cool water factory, and the mud mine factory, present carbonate production rates versus time and versus depths, which are completely different. In a tropical factory, mainly Jurassic, Cretaceous carbonate factories in the Tethys region, for example, the main carbonate production rates are usually found in shallower sections between 0 and 50 meters, and then you will see a clear drop in your production rate with depth. For example, cool water factories, their production rates are much less important, but they develop more in a shallow towards a deeper marine system. Here we can think about red algae or radiolaria, for example. And then finally, the mud mounds. The mud mounds usually produce in shallow to deeper water systems, and they also can be associated to some methane seeps in deeper water. So this is quite crucial because you need to input all of these carbonate laws into your carbonate model at the end of the day, because we are modeling ecology of carbonate production. Other than that, as you can see on the right section, also gathered from Schlager et al. And many other people who have worked on carbonate systems, you can see that carbonate along the ancient time, but also in the recent times, produce in different traits. So you need to understand your carbonate fauna and your carbonate textures and facies so that you will be able to assess what type of carbonate production you will have versus time and versus depth. So carbonate are also impacted by wave energy. Wave energy will not only add turbidity to the water, some carbonates like turbidity, like for example Corallian systems, but also will have an influencing on the transport of your carbonate systems. And because of wave energy and also because of wave diffraction, your carbonate platform or your shoal will have a specific type of geometry and a specific type of facies display laterally, but also vertically. Note very well that different types of carbonates have a different ecological affinity. For example, some encrusting coralline systems, they would like more wave energy to be at a higher pace, while grazing lawns, for example, or Litocodium bassanella mounds, they would like much less energy into the system. So now I leave you with Samer, who will discuss more the implementation of these different types of ecological parameters into the Dionysos forest stratigraphic model.
Thank you, Nicolas. So now we had an introduction to the phenomena, to the parameters and processes that we need to take into account and input into a numerical model. Let's have a look a little bit at some of those parameters in DionisosFlow. How do we deal with them? How do we translate them into a numerical model? So what we can do in Dionysos is to we have a production rate by type of carbonate. We can have different type of carbonate, and then we can constrain that production depending on ecological parameters, bathymetry, wave energy parameters. So we can constrain to location, for example, lake, intertidal, marine environment. We can constrain to the seafloor lithology, so different types of carbonate grow on different substratum, but also to salinity, to water turbidity, which can be very important in case of a mixed system where you could have a clastic source causing turbidity in the water column and affecting the light and the depth, and then eventually affecting the carbonate's growth. But you could also have constraints related to bathymetry and wave energy. We can add to that then some carbonate dissolution and calculation of exposure time and transformation to bioclast, which would be a sort of way to deal with diagenesis in carbonates. And then, of course, as Nicolas said, the wave energy is very important in growth and also in transport of carbonates. So here we have an advanced wave propagation model that allows for wave refraction, but we also have the possibility to use multiple waves active at different ages and different water depth and in different frequency. That allows for mimicking several natural phenomena, such as the seasonal fluctuation in the trade wind and in the wind direction, but also it allows for mimicking storm events in like low frequency, very high energy wave event. Now to the right, you see a model running in time. You see to the right the sea level. Now you're looking at the bathymetry results. So here you see different kind of bathymetry, and then you see the wave energy distribution, which is not, even though the wave is coming from this corner over here, you see that the wave energy is distributed not in a linear way, but it refracts based on the shape based on the bathymetry and the coastline. So here you see the growth of some bioconstructions and shoal complexes, and they prograde in several directions on this carbonate ramp, forming some nicely shaped clinoforms that are controlled in this case by sea level. Then you're looking again at the bathymetry and the wave energy, which is, as I said, distributed depending on the bathymetry and the shape of the coastline. And here you have your facies in which you can then transform in a few clicks into a synthetic seismic that you can compare to your seismic data. Now, we talked about the wave energy that affects the growth of carbonates and the production of different types of carbonate, but it also affects the transport of carbonates. And well, the way we transport all kinds of sediments in Dionysos is by using a diffusion equation that accounts for sediment transport through gravity, wave energy, and water transport. For the water type transport, this is only relevant if we have a mixed system where we have a water source, a fluvial source coming in. And we're also able to account for catastrophic events and slope failure and debris flows, of course. In terms of erosion, we have the capacity to account for different erosion rates for different sediments, which is also important for carbonates because we know that different types of carbonates have different thresholds for initiation of erosion and erosion rates. Now, we get a lot the question of how do we go from data into a full stratigraphic model? What's happening in between? What's the methodology like? Well, it's important to say here that it's not a reservoir modeling, traditional reservoir modeling approach, and it is not a petroleum system modeling methodology or philosophy. It's a little bit different, but we'll explain it a little bit briefly in this slide. So we start with data. We start with seismic, wells, sedimentology, stratigraphy, biostratigraphy, and we take a lot of input from those. Some input is direct, so goes directly into Dionysos, such as subsidence maps, which are derived from present-day thickness, for example, reconstructions of paleobathymetry, which is also coming from interpretation of the seismic. But then we also add to that some processes. So your static sea level curve, which static sea level curve to use, what's the magnitude of the variation, some diffusion parameters, diffusion coefficients, and carbonate factories parameters, production rates. So some of those parameters are directly coming from data, but many of them come from conceptual models. And the conceptual model itself is basically derived from data. So once we have those, we have tweaked the first, I would say, the first round of parameters. We're ready to run our simulation. We run the first simulation, then we look at calibration data. And in DionisosFlow, there's a set and a predefined post-processing workflow that allows you to easily compare to your calibration data, whether it's one-dimensional wireline logs or core data, or two-dimensional cross-sections, seismic interpreted sections, or 3D thickness maps. But we can also calibrate to outcrops or modern-day analogs. And the things we calibrate are the thickness, so we have to match to present-day thickness. Again, this is a forward approach. We start at a stage in the basin's history, and we fill it up to a certain point in time. Then we compare that interval we fill to the present day in terms of thickness, in terms of texture and facies, and in terms of geometries. So if I have clinoforms, I want to reproduce those clinoforms. If I have a channels and lobe system, submarine channels and lobe system, I have to reproduce those as well. Usually, this is not successfully done from the first round. So we have to go back to our input parameters, to our processes, and turn a few knobs again and re-simulate. Sometimes we'd have to go back to the conceptual model and revise it and find out that, well, our conceptual model was inconsistent and we couldn't have had it in a certain way. And then we run this loop a few times. It's an iterative approach until we have a best fit scenario that from which we can have our results, and we can analyze our results, which will be in the form of four-dimensional geological model that can provide me, if I'm working on basin scale with source rock, reservoir, and seal information. If I'm working on reservoir scale, then it's reservoir connectivity, net to gross, facies, and so on. And of course, I could take this further and perform uncertainty and sensitivity analysis thanks to our CoGarFlow software. But this is another topic that will be covered in a future webinar, which will be announced soon. Now I'll give the floor again to Nicolas to talk to us about some Mesozoic carbonate platforms and show us some real applications of DionisosFlow in carbonate platforms.
So thank you, Samer, very much for this introduction of how to input all the parameters in DionisosFlow. But one very important point, and before anyone begins modeling, you have to answer to many questions which are mainly related to what type of carbonate factory are you modeling. Different carbonate factories, different paleogeographical location of your carbonate systems will have different influence on the production of your carbonates, and will have also an impact on the type, texture, but also on the localization of these carbonate platforms and shoals, for example, or ramps. I would firstly be focusing on paleogeography. So you need to understand paleogeography to answer the question of what type of carbonate factory do you have, and then also what wave direction would you have, and are you in an open ocean or a closed marine system. I would also look at the type of geological model you're willing to test. Are you modeling a gentle slope ramp? Are you modeling a rimmed platform? Or are you modeling, for example, a specific localized shoal? So this is also very important for you to be able to input all the parameters that Samer talked about before. But also something which is very important is the eustatic curve you are going to use. Eustatic sea level curves, you know, there are global eustatic sea level curves, more regional and more local sea level curves. And depending on the type of system you are modeling, your choice will be having a major impact. For example, if you're modeling a Tethyan system, and we know that all the oceans are connected, you can use for example, the Hack or the Miller global eustatic sea level curves. But if you're trying to model carbonates developing in a lake, which are completely disconnected from your ocean, well, actually, you will need to develop or your own sea level curve, or you can use other local sea level curves that you might see or that you might have in the literature. So now I'll be focusing a bit on some peloidal and auritic shoals that you usually see a lot on the Mediterranean and even also in Middle Eastern carbonate systems. For those who are not very familiar with shoals, that these are usually developing in very shallow marine systems. They are constantly reworked by turbulent waters, and mainly they can develop into patchy geometries or architecture, but also some continuous one. So for us, and in order for us to model these types of shoals which represent major reservoirs in hydrocarbon system, we need firstly to model bathymetry. So we need to understand where are the locations in our system where we have shallow water, shallow marine systems, and where we have relatively deeper water system. For example, in red here, you will find the shallow water or shallow bathymetry, and the blue, you will find the deeper bathymetries. Other than that, we need to understand the influence of wave energy on our system. So shoaling are usually developed where we have usually higher, moderate to high wave energy. So as you can see here, the yellow display on the wave energy part showing you the relatively higher energy. So most probably you will be finding more reworking on this southern part of the grid. And finally, bathymetry wave energy will allow you to develop also carbonate systems, which are influenced by all the ecological parameters that we discussed early on. Combining all of these three grids, you will be able to generate a post-process facies model. So everything that you will see here in yellow represents extensive shoal, for example, in the southern part of the grid. This was an example of Kuwait, so this has also been published. We'll provide you with the publications when needed. And in the northern part, what's really interesting is the patchy components of these shoals. And if you're looking at the petroleum system element or at the reservoir behavior, of course, having an extensive shoal will have a completely different behavior than having a patchy shoal. So this should be really taken into account laterally. So you'll see the lateral changes in your facies, but also vertically. And because we are modeling in forward way, so in time, the next slide will show you how is the shoal evolving through time. And you'll see, Samer, please, yeah. You'll see the evolution of your shoal from T1 to T4, initiating from an inner ramp platform, which is gently dipping, into a more shoal dominated in a regressive system, and then the appearance of your small patchy shoals in the northern part of the country. I'm saying this just to highlight the influence and the importance of having sea level eustatic changes on the geometries of your carbonate systems, but also on the internal architectures and the facies. If you look at the nice videos on the upper right hand of your screen, you'll be able to see. Samir, can you please go back to the one before? Yes, thank you. So you can see now the evolution of platform with the sea level changes. So everything here in light blue will represent shallow marine systems, and everything in dark blue will represent deeper marine systems. And you can see the aggradations, you can see some of the progradations, the influence of sea level drop on the shift in your carbonate system. And you will see at some points where the localization will be of your coarser grain carbonates. Of course, coarser grain carbonates will be localized mainly in the shallower part or at the crest of your platform or your clinoforms, where you will have the highest wave energy. So understanding slope, looking at seismic data, and combining them with forward stratigraphic modeling will give you an idea for further prospects to test. Now we'll move on to the influence of siliciclastic system, and I've seen one of the questions that has been asked is the influence of siliciclastic, and can we model siliciclastic systems and carbonate systems into DionisosFlow? So yes, we can. In this example, I'm showing you the advance of a deltaic system. So everything that you will see in red and yellow represent channels and deltaic system advancing onto a carbonate platform. Usually we see this a lot in the Southeast Asia. And here what's really important is to try to understand what type of carbonate are you modeling and how do they behave with regards to your siliciclastics. Sometimes siliciclastic system will bring much more turbidity into your system and will influence the light transmission into water, but also the nutrient influx. And your shift of carbonate, as you can see, will be going towards the basal moored part while the delta is prograding onwards. So now I'll give you also another example, and I think many people have always requested to show this example. And this was one nice work that we've conducted on a complex reservoir carbonate system along the Arabian Plate. Here, this is just to show you that geological model is a model which is built not only on the integration of seismic data and well data, but also on generating and using concepts to try to predict in 2D, but also in 3D, the facies and the geometries that you see on your carbonate platform itself. This is an example where we show you a carbonate platform which is developed mainly by aggradation at the base. So Aptune 1, Aptune 2 in green represent mainly lithocodium basinella mounds, waxstone to packstone units, and then developing into a much more rudist-rich system, which is in yellow and red on the section of Al-Wazir et al. 2010, and then prograding systems are filling up your basin relatively quickly depending on the eustatic sea level changes. And you can see the vertical but also the lateral facies changes where you go from a rich floatstone to boundstone to grainstone unit, mainly proximal towards the margin side and the clinoform crest, into a much deeper and much finer dominated unit, mainly of mudstone and waxstone in the relatively deeper basin. So what we aim to do now is to answer through forward stratigraphic modeling some questions which are related to geometry, but also vertical and lateral facies displays. Of course, if you use only geostatistics and knowing carbonate system, you will not be able to answer in the details you want to all the variability in facies and architectures that you will see in your system. This is an example. So we try to reproduce the model by using a field scale model or Dionysos model of 40 by 20 kilometers. We used very high resolution cell sizes of simulation of 200 meters by 200 meters with time step, which are 50,000 years. Remember that here you're modeling stratigraphy. So you can model from 1,000 year time step up to 100,000 years or 1 million years time step, depending on the model that you're aiming to build. Of course, the shorter the time steps, the higher the resolution will be. So here, what we successfully modeled is the different types of architectures and geometries that we see into our carbonate system. We can see algal mounds, so patchy mounds developing with floatstone and some grainstone, which are relatively patchy. Because of the change in your sea level framework, you will generate what we call a mound coalescence and platform aggradation. So we coalesce the mounds here in the southern part of the unit, and we develop a platform which is colored in brown, which is mainly dominated by higher wave energies, and more towards the offshore where we have the blue colors, which is relatively less influenced by the wave energy because the bathymetries are relatively deeper. Something which is also very interesting in such type of model is to be able to capture the, for example, the belt development of rudist or floatstone units or boundstone units. As you can see in the right lower part of the figure that you have here, carbonate platform aggradation to progradation. And then you can see that you're also able to capture the lagoonal part, which are more muddy and more wacky in the internal part. And finally, the big planiform geometries that you see prograding towards the basin and the change in facies and the change in textures along these carbonate systems. Finally, integrating a texture model with all the ecological parameters of wave energy, bathymetry, carbonate production rate, you will be able to generate a facies association model. So you can model lithologies, you can model textures, and also you can model or generate post-process facies association, which will be needed in your reservoir model. A wax stone present in a lagoon might have completely different behaviors than a wax stone which is present on the toe of slope or even in the basinal part. So you can segregate between them into your reservoir model, and this is very important. Finally, I want also to mention something which is very important, and maybe we'll discuss this later on with its evaporite and diagenetic impact. All the input parameters that Samer talked about will allow us to build up the forward stratigraphic model, and then we generate outputs out of these input parameters. The outputs will be bathymetric model and water turbidity models, salinity calculation, which is very important for the development of evaporites or salt, lithology and texture, and sedimentation rates. And then what's crucial in the model, and whenever you're thinking about diagenesis, primary diagenesis mainly, you'll be looking at residence time. So how much time your system has been below water and how much time was it exposed. By combining all of these grids that you generate from your model, you will be able to qualitatively assess your diagenesis, your dolomite mapping, for example, your karstification, and comparing your well data or your syn sections to your model. I just want to point out now that IFP is conducting a more quantitative approach, so this is still under development, and new publications will be dealing with this information at a later step. We will conduct a focus on diagenesis in another webinar, but also we're ready to answer your questions on that. So now we'll move to the questions, Samer.
Alcide, I think we'll handle that.
Yes, I will handle the Q&A break. So the first question we had from Marie is, do I understand properly that we can have clastics and carbonates in the same model?
Yes.
So very quickly, because you already answered it, Nicolas. So yes, we can have a pure clastic, pure carbonate, or a mixed between clastic and carbonate that will be taken into account in the same time during the same simulation and the same model. So I will move to the second question, which is, how do you manage changes in porosity and compaction decompaction in your calibration workflow?
This is excellent. You can add compaction curves depending on the different types of lithologies you are modeling. So yes, you can use compaction, and the model will calculate for you through time the evolution of porosity. So this can be directly integrated. Yeah.
So you showed that we enter the wave system in the model, but what about the tidal influence? Is it included too? Okay, so for the tidal influence, the things are a bit more complex because usually tides work on a much shorter time frame. Remember here, the time frames that we use are thousands of years or tens of thousands of years. We have a tidal module that you can press
into the model. So you can integrate tides, but I have to be very careful when modeling tides. You need to have very good constraints to be able to calibrate this. Tidal influences on a very short time, and these types of model usually simulate a stratigraphy which is at a longer time frame.
What is the time resolution and cell size of the models that you have shown in your presentation?
Okay, you have the different types of models. You have the model which are of very high resolution. Usually I went up to 1,000 years time step when modeling carbonate. So this is the maximum that we can get. And the cell sizes usually will reach about 100. I would not go maybe 50 to 100 meters cell sizes. And then you can go up depending on your model. If you're looking at a more basin scale, of course, you'll be looking at 100,000 years time step or 200,000 years time step. And of course, cell sizes which can reach tens of kilometers, depending on the size of the model.
What are the convergence constraints for the simulation parts of these regional models in complex carbonate system? And then I will answer the second part of the question.
Okay, so many type of convergence constraints. Usually, you can use the thickness maps from the seismic interpretation. You can use well data also, which you can compare on thickness and facies. So we have developed internally with Alcide and many other people who have contributed to that, what we call calibration indicators. These calibration indicators will allow you to compare directly your model in terms of facies, in terms of texture, in terms of geometry, directly to your initial data set. It can be seismic, it can be seismic calibration, seismic characterization, it can be seismic structural interpretation, it can be well data, but also you can transfer, as Samer showed you, the modeling grid into a seismic grid and compare the amplitude together.
Okay, so the second part of the question is, do we use an in-house or commercially available simulator for that? So let me answer you that yes, everything that you've seen here is coming from DionisosFlow, which is a product of IFP commercialized by Beicip, and we use it to do some consulting work, or we can also provide it to any person working within the industry, and feel free to contact us directly later on if you want to have more information on that and if you want to test it. So next question, and I will just take two more questions and then we can move on. So the next one is, subsurface data is not always available for researchers. Do you think that we can use the same concepts on outcrops?
Yes.
If yes,
definitely. Forest stratigraphic modeling has been mainly built based on outcrops. So all the equations that are usually integrated in a forest stratigraphic model or a Dionysos model are mainly diffusion based. So these are mainly based on outcrops, and then they have been using subsurface to propagate in 2D and 3D. So no problem with that. You just need to be very careful on the scale you are willing to model. You cannot, this is a diffusion equation. So usually diffusion equation for CDC clastics works up to, I would say, as a minimum of hundreds of meters. Of lateral variability of cells and modeling in thousands of years of time step. If you're looking at carbonates, maybe because the production is mainly in situ, you can go up to 50-meter cell sizes, but still you have to be very careful because of the transport parameters in your diffusion equation. Yeah. This is not an Navier-Stokes, so you have to be careful.
And final question, because we already reached our 30-minute limits. Which types of dolomitization are you able to simulate? Also post-depositional?
Okay, something very important is that all the mapping on dolomites and the mapping on evaporites and diagenesis is qualitative at this time. So what we usually do, we don't model, we post-process. So we model carbonates, we model evaporite, and then we post-process them by generating equation to say, okay, if I have carbonate overlain by evaporite and a residence time of, I don't know, 200,000 years, then I will most probably be dissolving and generating dolomite, or cementing and generating maybe more mudstone. Now IFP is working on the part of, which is more related to reactive transport and dolomitization modeling, but this is not yet integrated into the forest stratigraphic model now. Hopefully by next year you will have a module related to that.
So thank you, Nicolas. I will keep the questions that keep coming for the last break, or I will answer them directly. We have a poll that has been put in the polls panel, so please check it so that you can answer it, and I will put another one around the end of the presentation. And I think we can now move on to the next section. Thank you.
Thank you, Alcide. So now that we have talked about the forest stratigraphic modeling part on the reservoirs, on carbonate reservoirs, let's talk a bit on what we do with it afterwards. What are the options that we have in terms of enhancing our reservoir understanding and reservoir characterization workflows? So before we go into that, let's talk a little bit on the significance of doing that. Why bother to integrate a forward stratigraphic model with geostatistics, for example? And the significance there lies in the ability of forward stratigraphic modeling to provide a realistic three-dimensional sediment and depositional geometries, so sediment distribution and depositional geometries that honors the sequence stratigraphy and the GDE concept, a methodology that sees maximum flooding surfaces, it sees sequence boundaries, it sees the chronostratigraphy and the lithostratigraphy, which is usually something that is not really taken into account in traditional geostatistical approaches, which are usually used on to construct geomodels for reservoir modeling. Another significance is in the ability of this methodology to bridge the gap between different scales in resolution of scales in different data. For example, seismic data has a very high horizontal, lateral resolution, while vertically it has very low vertical resolution, but cores and well data has it's the other way around. So it has a high vertical resolution but very low horizontal resolution, and there is a very big, very important role that forward stratigraphic modeling can play is in bridging that gap using a process, using geological processes that we can calibrate, and then we can bridge that gap to the reservoir scale. And the fourth big significance is a unique opportunity that this integration provides that allows us to account for geological uncertainties, meaning we can, thanks to our COGAR-Flow uncertainty and sensitivity analysis solution, we can analyze the forward stratigraphic model and assess the geological uncertainty. And then when we integrate these with the geostatistics, we are able to really translate the geological uncertainties into reservoir models eventually. Now, the options you have there for that to perform such an integration basically can be divided into two categories here in option A and option B. So here we're starting in a point where you have a forward stratigraphic model on your reservoir scale. So you have calibrated it, you have a model. What to do with it next? How to get the most out of it for your reservoir simulations. So one option, option A, would be the more direct use. So you take the DionisosFlow forward stratigraphic model and you use it as received, so as it is, and you run your flow simulations on. Of course, you have to bring it down to present-day geometries. You can do that in Dionisos itself or in other geocellular software available on the market. The other option in here is basically to adjust that forward stratigraphic model a little bit with geostatistical algorithms, and there that adjustment is meant to match the forward stratigraphic model 100% to wells. Note that forward stratigraphic models are process-based models, so they are never 100% matched to the calibration data because it's process controlled, not data controlled. So we match to 80%, 90% maximum. That's an excellent calibration. But then you have the opportunity to, using geostatistical algorithms, to match 100% to your well, and then they run the reservoir models on 100% or almost 100% calibrated model. So that is the option A category, which is a more or less direct usage of the forward stratigraphic model as your reservoir model. The other option is to extract soft constraints to use in whatever geostatistical methodology you adapt in-house. So for example, you could, for TGS, you could extract some vertical proportion curves. You could also extract, for MPS, you can get some training images that you could use for your simulations as a soft constraint that it will accompany your well data and your seismic data when you're doing geostatistics. An example of the effect of that, just briefly, there's several advantages for using that, and they range from better VPCs to better variograms. But an example of what difference makes with using Dionysos or without using Dionysos. Here you see an extraction of the same from the same unit in the model we had in the previous slide. These are facies, textures maps from to the left, DionisosFlow model only, calibrated to 80–90%. Bottom left, you have DionisosFlow matched 100%, almost 100% to the well data using a TGS algorithm. Top right, you have a geostatistical simulation matched only to wells without any Dionysos input. And bottom right, you have a geostatistical algorithm matched to wells and with a soft constraint such as DionisosFlow VPC. So VPC is coming from the forward stratigraphic model. And what we could see here that the three of those maps have very similar reservoir behavior, because here the yellow is the reservoir basically. So we have this map, the DionisosFlow alone, the DionisosFlow matched to the wells, and the geostatistics with a DionisosFlow input have a reservoir in this unit that is more or less connected and will behave similarly in flow simulations. While with the geostatistics unsupported by Dionysos input, you'd have a very different flow behavior. That is just one quick example of how much a difference it might make on the reservoir scale and on the reservoir behavior by incorporating this geological aspect into your reservoir model, bringing it from DionisosFlow and from forward stratigraphic modeling. As I said, there's other ways to incorporate with variograms and VPCs and training images, but to finish this, one very important and unique opportunity that this integration allows is the integration of uncertainty into your geomodel and your reservoir model eventually. So thanks to our Cougar Flow solution, you can thoroughly analyze the sensitivity and uncertainty of your forward stratigraphic model through response surface modeling. And from that response surface, you can generate thousands of results on which you can do proper probability maps or grids of the different facies that can then be used as, for example, training images for your geostatistical simulations or other ways to use as soft constraints in your geomodels. And with that, you're able to incorporate that geological uncertainty into your geomodel and reservoir model eventually. And with that, we have reached the end of, the last bit of this webinar. And now we think we can have a few minutes for the last Q&A break. So Alcide.
Samer, so I answered the last two questions we had. So actually, while people maybe want to ask some questions, I can ask you the first one, and say also that I have put a new poll. So please check it to help us know what we are going to do afterwards. So just for everyone to know the answer, what is the largest regional model that we have carried out, and is it possible to produce super regional models covering more than 10,000 square kilometers?
Yes, of course, you are able to produce super regional models actually, and we know of attempts to model like full continental, ongoing projects that are modeling full continental margins of we can't say where, but really mega scale models basically. So this is a methodology that is very versatile in terms of scale application, and it's easier to go bigger actually than to go smaller. So yeah, you can go into mega basins basically.
So for the probability maps, are they generated from Dionysos or from a different module?
The probability maps are generated from Cougar Flow, which is a software on the same platform as DionisosFlow, so which is our open flow platform that has several software. So you can take your Dionysos model and seamlessly run multi-realizations on and produce those probability maps basically on the same platform, but using a different tool.
Yes. So what are the export formats that are available for the modeling? And what are the industry and with which industry standard are we compatible and seamless?
Well, there is it's quite a list of export formats, but I can tell you that we have we have a Petrel link, so you can seamlessly export or import in both directions any kind of results or input data or the full grid into Petrel. But we also are working with on another link with GGS, with Decision Space, for a seamless link that will allow a very good integration between both softwares. But we also have the possibility to export in very different formats that are usually compatible with most industry standards.
So yes, just to add up to that, so we have the direct links and we have GRDCL and ResQML formats that will allow you to export. So the ResQML actually is the best format to export your grid and re-import it. So normally it's a combined approach with all the, it's an industry standard that has been discussed with other companies that should be normally, you should be able to import it within any software. Can the synthetic seismic generated on Dionysos be exported as a SegWi format?
Yes, yes, absolutely.
Yes, yes. The answer is yes.
The short answer, yes. It's yeah, you can do that.
Okay, so I think that concludes our meeting. We answered all the questions. Oh, okay. One final question. Is it possible to extend your domain even after you simulated it? In other words, let's assume that you generated a full model, but in the end you realized that you need a larger domain. What would you do?
There you have to rerun the model basically, but it's easy to incorporate and extend then the model in another scenario. But you have to basically almost rerun a new model.
Okay.
But then you could of course use the same parameters and just extend the domain. So it's not that much more work actually.
Okay, so I think that is it. So thank you very much, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the meeting and that you learned new things today. So as mentioned before, the video of this meeting will be available on our YouTube channel in a few days. If you want to know more, or if you want to actually have more information, feel free to contact us. If you want to test the software, also feel free to contact us. So info@beicip.com, or contact us on our LinkedIn page without any problem. We hope to see you in our future webinar sessions. So there will be new webinar sessions. So please check our LinkedIn page or our websites to know the future sessions. Thank you and have a very good day.